Hey guys, welcome to another video. And I believe, I'm not sure, but I believe this is probably the first comic book. Well, not the first comic book, but the first American comic book. Let's put it that way. The first American comic book to be reviewed on the channel. Lady Death. What can I say about Lady Death? Not a whole lot, if I'm being very honest. Alright. I seem to have gotten ahead of myself, so let's dial it back. To start off, the character of Lady Death started out with, I believe it was Chaos Comics, back in the sort of early 90s. She first appeared in Evil Ernie Youth Gone Wild in 1991, I believe, and that series was published by Chaos Comics, I think. Although I think at that time it was probably called Coffin Comics or something like that. And she was the sexy kind of delusions of the main character, Evil Ernie, in that series. Sort of a sideshow villain, kind of there to cause trouble. And the character proved to be popular enough that she got her first solo story in 1994 with The Reckoning. Now, this is interesting because the Lady Death, The Reckoning, Lady Death's first solo outing in the comics, was actually adapted into an animated feature in 2004, which is actually how I learned about the character, was through the movie. And the two plots, sorry guys, I got seriously itchy here, but two plots are pretty much the same. You have Hope, the daughter of a warlord. In the film, her father is the devil, but in the comic, not so much. I found it interesting because I watched the film and I thought, oh well, meh, it was okay. But you know, what about the comics? What about the source material? Because the movie wasn't great, but it was enough. It kept my attention long enough that it kind of persuaded me to look into the comics. And when I started reading the Lady Death comics, I was actually kind of disappointed in the film. I mean, in the film, yes, she ends up in hell. She ends up fighting with against the devil. And I mean, the same thing pretty much happens in the comic. The biggest difference being that her father isn't like literally the devil. He's just a warlord who's a little bit power hungry. And she ends up in hell. She ends up fighting him, as always. But now you've got the actual devil kind of on the sidelines, just sort of watching and playing everybody for a fool, which, admittedly, I have to admit I quite like that. I did kind of feel that the film failed in that regard. I mean, yeah, having the devil be her father was kind of a good idea, but it would have been more interesting to me if the two had been separate. Um, uh, so yeah, general plot. I mean, you've got Hope, daughter of the warlord, who, in the film he's the devil. In the comic, he's just someone who's like almost like a devil fanboy, I guess. He wants to rule hell, and nothing's going to stop him. He's going to do whatever it takes. Of course, when Hope ends up in hell, courtesy of a rather unhappy mob of villagers, well, things don't exactly go according to plan. Pros and cons to the series. And the characters were all quite good. I have to admit, I liked the characters. The court jester of Pagan, I believe is his name. He's such an unlikable. He's a pain in the ass, but he's so much fun to watch. And I mean, in the film, you don't really get a sense of who Pagan is. In the film, he's just kind of this irritating side character. You see him on screen and you go, "Oh no, not this guy again." But in the comic, he's actually pretty threatening. I haven't read the original, the Reckoning in a while, but from what I recall, he is genuinely threatening. The mob, the villagers are all kind of just meh. It's like cannon fodder. They're there to basically pad out the story. I will say I quite like the commentary that one of the characters mentions, because he's talking about how he studied medicine, and he's talking about treating boils, because apparently the way they're doing it in the village is when someone comes down with the plague and they get these like boils, they bring in leeches and priests and things. And this guy is saying, "Oh, but lance the boils, lance the wounds." And this is a completely alien concept, and he sort of jabs at them for that, which I thought was quite steep, but I mean, logical. So the characters were nice. The story was interesting. I mean, the story was. It's not the typical. It's not something that I'd ever seen before in a comic book. But to be fair, I grew up reading, Batman and Spider-Man and those kinds of comics. I didn't really go to the horror comics. In fact, most horror comics, like Lady Death and all these other like hardcore horror series, were pretty much kept out of reach. A lot of bookstores in South Africa, at least to my knowledge, didn't stock horror comics, and those who did generally kept them out of reach of young children. Either that, or you had to specially order. these books. So yeah, I didn't really get a whole lot of exposure to horror comics as a kid. Cons, I mean, the pacing feels a little bit erratic. It starts out okay, but then you get these segments where you're not quite sure what's happening, where, or when it happened, or why it happened. Although, I mean, that could just be my memory sort of playing tricks on me. But anyway, so there's that. The artwork was... I'm trying to think of a polite word to use. It wasn't bad. I have to be honest, it wasn't that bad. It just wasn't good. It was okay, but I think it could have been better. Let's put it that way. Ultimately, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those series that you kind of have to just, I guess, make up your own mind and decide whether you like it or not. I personally enjoyed it, and I wish that the film had incorporated more of the comic book into it instead of the lackluster result that we got. Actually bring in all the side characters. Make Matthias and Lucifer separate entities. Bring in the 9 princes of hell, or the archdukes of hell, or whatever they're called. Actually have them come in and do all the big battle scenes, and incorporate the plague scenes in the village, and all of that stuff. And there was a lot of really hardcore R-rated material in the comic, which could have done really well if they put it in a film, and they didn't. So, yeah. Ultimately, it's up to you. If you're interested in the series and you want to check it out, go for it. Personally, I would only recommend it if you are really into horror stuff. If you're squeamish about gore, then yeah, you might not like this one as much. From what I remember, the gore isn't that prominent until you get to I think it's the 2nd volume, or maybe the 3rd volume, or something like that. Once they're in hell, then it seems I've got a cat trying to get my attention. But yeah, once they get into hell, then things kind of go a little bit crazy. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. Aesthetically, it kind of depends. I personally thought that the art style could have been a little bit more streamlined. But personally, I really enjoyed the series. For all its flaws, I really enjoyed the series. And it was nice to see kind of where Lady Death was before she became Lady Death. And, how she ended up where she was in Evil Ernie, in her first appearance. So that was something. That was really cool. But yeah, I'd only really recommend it if you're really into horror stuff. If you're curious and you want to check it out, but you're not really into horror, go for it, by all means. That's about all I can say, really. So I will sign off and say go for it if you want to check it out. If not, well, I'm sure there are other series out there that'll catch your attention. But if you have read the series, let me know. I'd love to know your thoughts on it and whether you enjoyed it and what you enjoyed about it and stuff like that. So, yeah, I'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching. Cheers.